That the question be now put.
Sue Kedgley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Well, I have two particular names that I would like to suggest for this bill, for the name of this bill. The first one is Rogernomics Part 2, and the second one is the Roger Kerr implementation, or the Business Roundtable implementation bill. Now, it is Rogernomics Part 2 because this is what this bill does. It implements the Act and the Business Roundtable's agenda of corporatising as much of local government as possible and allowing councils to sell off their strategic assets without having to go through the inconvenience of informing their residents or even bothering to consult with them. This is what this bill does. Mr Hyde and the Business Roundtable, they've had to sit on their hands for 3 frustrating years because the privatisation of state-owned assets has been ruled out by this government. That is for the next, for what they're hoping will be their next term of government. So while they are having to sit with frustration, unable to sell off the state-owned assets, they have bided their time by focusing on local government. And nobody is surprised that Mr Hyde got his prize of being the Minister of Local Government and immediately set about making radical, far-reaching changes to local government, and this is not just getting rid of Environment Canterbury, not just setting up, obliterating 8 democratically elected councils in Auckland, but now we have the prize. We have the prize of this bill, which will it will encourage councils through a series of provisions in this bill to corporatise as many of their assets as possible, and it will allow them to sell off their assets without having to consult, and even their water assets. But the second possible name for this bill is the Business Roundtable or the Roger Kerr implementation bill, because Roger Kerr has been lobbying for the provisions of this bill for 2 decades, and I have a series of his papers here which I'm going to read from. This is what he has been lobbying for 2 decades. This is the prize of opening up local government to the multinational corporations that he represents. And he will be listening with mounting satisfaction to this debate and to and this is Mr. Nick Smith says this is outrageous. Mr. Smith, this is exactly what is happening. You may pretend otherwise. This bill will allow Veolia, the largest multinational water corporation in the world, to own our water assets for up to 35 years. And if that isn't water privatisation, dream on. Anyway, as I was saying, Roger Kerr has been lobbying for this, and one can only imagine the amount of behind-the-scenes lobbying by Veolia, by the Business Roundtable, by Roger Kerr, by Suez to get this bill, lobbying in secret by the vested interests to get this prize, which is what this is for them. What he points out, what he's been pointing out since the 90s, is that owning water is a $300 billion business. And he's saying, why can't we open up our water supplies in New Zealand to water privatisation, to water companies? And he acknowledges in these series of papers, he says, you know, it is controversial, but he says water. He says it's not a human right. It's not a precious resource. It's not one of the life support systems of our planet. He says it's an economic commodity, and it should be treated as an economic commodity, and it should be run by the market, by multinational corporations. And then he talks about the opposition to water privatisation, which he gets increasingly frustrated by. And he says, well, look, why not? This is his strategy. He says, look, go for partial water privatisation, not complete outright. Pretend that the councils will still remain ownership of them. just come up with some what he calls partial privatisation, allowing councils to hand over the water supplies for 35 years to private corporations.
Dr. Kem Calder.